Chapter 3: Consequences of Suicide. Let us begin our reflections on the consequences of suicide by studying question 957 of the Spirit's book, in which Allan Kardec asks the enlightened spirits the following. 957. What is the state of the spirit after suicide? The consequences vary according to circumstances, but one penalty that no suicide escapes is disappointment. Some suicides, it is true, face the atonement for their fault at once. Others do so in a new earthly life, harder to bear than the one they cut off. We can observe that our spiritual benefactors tell us in different words that each case is unique. Regarding suicide, there are always mitigating and aggravating factors related to the act. However, there is always disappointment. As we studied in previous chapters, the person who commits suicide wishes to die, seeking to completely annihilate their life. However, since death does not exist, everything is life. He will physically discarnate, but continue to live, and the consequence, in all cases, is the disappointment of remaining alive with all the suffering that they brought from the physical life. Allan Kardec's comment on the issue, writing as follows. Observation confirms the statement that the consequences of suicide are not the same in all cases. It also shows us that some consequences are identical in all cases of violent death. Foremost among these is the greater persistence, along with all its unfortunate effects, of the link that unites the spirit and body. In nearly all these cases, this link is in its full strength when it is suddenly snapped, whereas it weakens gradually when death results from natural causes and often breaks before life is completely extinct. Figure 1 portrays a descriptive image of what Allan Kardec was discussing. Figure 1. Fluidic bond that unites the spirit to the body. Schematically, we see a person lying down with the spirit and perispirit at its side and out of the body, united by a fluidic cord. The energetic cord, or link uniting the spirit with the body, is the link referred to by Kardec in the commentary above. With suicide, this link is severed violently and abruptly, something that does not occur during natural death, where the link uniting the spirit with the body weakens over time. We continue with Allan Kardec's commentary to question 957. The consequences of a violent death are, first, the prolongation of the mental confusion that usually follows death, and second, the illusion that causes a spirit to believe that it is living its earthly life. Due to the violent rupture of ties uniting the spirit to the body, the recently deceased believes he is still incarnated, alive within the body. The state of spiritual confusion will be relatively lengthy. Let us study question 155 from the Spirit's book for better clarification of this subject. Question 155. How is the separation of the soul and body brought about? When the bonds that keep the soul linked to the body break, the soul disengages itself. Does this transition come about instantaneously and abruptly? There, between life and death, a distinct line of demarcation? No, the soul disengages itself gradually. It doesn't escape from the body at all. Once, like a bird that suddenly finds a cage open, the two states touch and blend into each other. The spirit frees itself little by little from its fleshy bonds, which loosen but for a time do not break entirely. In these answers, our spiritual benefactors are talking about natural death, which does not occur in death by suicide. Instead of natural detachment, the link connecting the spirit to the body is severed abruptly after suicide. Let us examine Allan Kardec's commentary to the previous question. He says, during life, a spirit is held to the body by its semi-material envelope, or perispirit. Death destroys the body, but not this second envelope, which separates itself from the body at death. We are all composed of three parts: body, perispirit, and spirit. The spirit is the divine essence. the thinking being, enveloped by a semi-material body. The perispirit, which is made of matter in a quintessential, more refined state, and the third part, the physical body. Energetic bonds unite the spirit with the perispirit, and connecting the perispirit with the body, there are further energetic bonds. During natural death, these connections are gradually extinguished, and under these circumstances, the spirit is liberated from its body when a person disincarnates. When death occurs abruptly, especially through suicide, the violent repercussions of the body's demise is passed on to the perispirit. Kardec continues explaining, observations show us that the separation of the perispirit from the body doesn't happen abruptly at the moment of death, but happens gradually with various degrees of slowness in different individuals. In some cases, it happens so quickly that the perispirit is entirely separated from the body within a few hours. In others, and especially in those whose lives have been highly materialistic and sensual, the release is much slower, sometimes taking days, weeks, even months. This delay doesn't mean that the life of the body in any way continues or that there is any possibility that the body will return to life. It is simply the return of an affinity between the body and the spirit, which is always more or less tenacious, depending on how close to material life the spirit was while on earth. Allan Kardec explains that the type of moral life the individual had while incarnated is directly reflected in the process by which the physical body dies. The more spiritualized a person is, the faster the spirit detaches itself from the body. And as an example, the more sensualistic a person is, the process of detachment is slower, lasting months and even years. Although there are exceptions, the detachment process is extremely slow after suicide, and the tendency is for the spirit to remain attached to the body until all the vital energy has extinguished, a cycle normally ending at the moment the spirit naturally disincarnates. Thus, a person who has reincarnated to live 60 years and commits suicide at 50 will generally tend to continue tied to the physical body for the previously planned and remaining 10 years of life, even though the physical body has died. In this case, although the body-spirit ties are violently severed, they are still bound by the vital energy embedded in the physical body. Continuing with Kardec's commentary, it is then only rational to suppose that the closer a spirit has identified itself with matter, the greater the difficulty it will have in separating from this material body. On the contrary, intellectual and introspective activity and habitual elevation of thought causes this separation to start even during the life of the body. Thus, when death occurs, the separation is almost instantaneous. The study of a great number of individuals has also shown that an excessive identification between the soul and the body can, after death, be extremely distressing, since, by resonance, such identification forces the spirit into an awareness of the horror of the bodily decomposition. Such unfortunate experiences are the exception rather than the rule. It is peculiar only to certain kinds of life and certain kinds of death. It occurs sometimes in cases of suicides. Persons who are more spiritually inclined begin to detach from the body before their actual disincarnation as a result of a life geared towards moral and intellectual perspectives. On the other hand, a materialistic person often experiences the horrors of their own body's decomposition. This is very common with suicides, but it may also occur in the case of persons who are extreme sensualists, who die and remain attached to their own bodies, suffering the consequences of decomposition. In question 165, Kardec makes a very interesting comment. Let's study it. At the moment of death, everything appears confused. The spirit takes time to recover self-consciousness. Seemingly, it is stunned, like someone who suddenly wakes up out of a deep sleep and needs a few minutes to get his or her bearing. Gradually, though, bodily impressions dissipate. The fog obscuring the spirit's perception lifts, and the spirit regains clearness of thought and its memory of the past. The length of this confused state varies considerably. It may be only a few hours. It may be for several months, or even years. It is least for spirits who, during the incarnate life, identify themselves most closely with their future state, since they are sooner able to understand their new situation. The state of confusion takes on special aspects depending on individual character and manner of death. In cases of violent or sudden death, by suicide, capital punishment, accident, stroke, etc., the spirit is often astounded, doesn't believe itself to be dead, and stubbornly persists in asserting the contrary. In question 257 of the Spirit's book, when Carter discusses the theoretical study of the sensation of spirits, the following is described. Observation has revealed that the spiritual body, or perispirit, disengages itself slowly from the body at death. During the first few moments, a spirit does not clearly understand its situation and thinks of itself as living rather than dead. It sees its body beside it and knows the body is its own, but does not understand that it is separated from the body. The state of confusion continues as long as the slightest connection between the body and the perispirit remains. An individual who had committed suicide said to us, "No, I am not dead," and added, "And yet I feel the worms devouring my body." Now the worms were certainly not devouring its perispirit, still less the spirit itself. But through a sort of psychic resonance, it received the sensation of what was going on in the discarded corpse. It was the sight of the decaying body that produced the illusion of decay, and it was this that the spirit mistook its own reality. Memory, then, did not produce the sensation of suffering here, but the perception of something actually taking place. With these elements in mind, let us see what conclusions we might draw from these facts by studying them carefully. These explanations offered by Kardec are very interesting and describe that in death, much of what occurs to those who commit suicide, and also to those who lived a hedonistic life, are simply impressions of what was taking place in the physical body, now manifesting on the perispirit. Many times the body has decomposed and has been consumed by microorganisms and worms. However, even as time passes, the person will continue to feel the horrors of decomposition, as we will study later. The events that take place with the physical body after it dies are imprinted upon the perispirit with such intensity that the spirit feels as if it was still being consumed by worms. In reality, in extreme circumstances, these can be the result of the sudden break between the connections that link the spirit and the body. The more abrupt and intense the rupture, the greater the repercussions that follow disincarnation. Let us return to Allan Kardec's commentary in question 957 regarding the consequences of suicide. The affinity that continues to exist between the spirit and the body produces various repercussions. Thus, the spirit may be forced to watch the process of bodily decay, a sight it may be bound to witness for a long time. In certain cases, for the length of time it had left to live on earth. This is not a general rule, but the suicide sooner or later will have to account for its actions. Many spirits who led miserable lives in their last incarnation have said that they volunteered for those trials in order to acquire resignation, the lack of which had led to suicide in a previous life. In other cases, the repercussion takes the form of an attachment to the physical body from which the suicide struggles in vain to free itself. In still other instances, it takes the form of acute regret in having done something so utterly useless and disappointing. Religion, ethics, and philosophy all condemn suicide as contrary to the laws of nature. All assert the principle that we have no right to shorten our lives voluntarily. But why don't we have that right? Why aren't we free to put an end to our sufferings? Spiritism explains, through the example of the spirits who have surrendered to the temptation, that suicide is not only a sign of weakness and an offense against the moral law, though some people will not give this aspect much importance, but that it is also an act at once witless and irresponsible, since no benefit can possibly come from it. The arguments of Spiritism on this subject are not merely theoretical, they place facts of the case before our eyes. As we've stated in previous chapters, if everything is life and a person seeks death by suicide, as Kardec described, this is a stupid act that will bring no benefit to the person. On the contrary, it will only make things worse. We will turn now to a memorable example that illustrates the theoretical questions we have addressed. It is taken from the book of Memories of a Suicide by Camilo Castillo Branco, a work psychographed by the medium Yvonne A. Pereira. We recommended this book to those who seek a greater understanding of suicide, since we will only touch upon a few sections of this monumental work in which the author shares his own personal experience. The book is rich in Spiritist clarifications, highlighting Kardec's basic writings, and should be studied by all those who seek to deepen their knowledge of Spiritism. In this book, Yvonne Pereira uses pseudonym Camilo Cândido Botelho, who is in fact the Portuguese writer Camilo Ferreira Botelho. Castillo Branco, whose biographical information takes from Wikipedia, follows. Camilo Castillo Branco, as he was properly known, was born in Lisbon, in Largo do Carmo, on March 16, 1825. He had a troubled, passionate, and impulsive life. He was a novelist, chronicler, critic, playwright, historian, poet, translator, and the first writer in the Portuguese language to live exclusively from his literary works. Even while writing for the public and subjecting himself to the literacy trends of his days, his writing was very original. Progressive blindness kept Camilo from reading and working, causing him to fall into great despair. After an ophthalmologist confirmed the seriousness of his condition on June 1st, 1890, Camilo took a revolver to his right temple and pulled the trigger at 3:15 p.m. and died the same day at 5 p.m. Camilo's testimony, which we will read in subsequent chapters, clearly demonstrates that suicide is a false solution, creating only disappointment, as our spiritual mentors tell us in their response to question 957 in the Spirit's book. Below is Camilo's description of what occurred after he took his life. It is an intense report demonstrating in very raw terms everything that happened after his violent death. It serves as a cautionary tale to those who erroneously think that suicide will solve their problems and end their suffering, believing that nothingness follows physical death. The first hours that followed my brutal act against myself passed without my being able to get a hold of myself. My spirit, cruelly violated, sort of fainted, suffering an ignoble collapse. My senses, my faculties that represent the rational self, became paralyzed, as if an indescribable cataclysm had dashed the world to pieces, and upon the rubble a strong sensation of annihilation descended on my being. It was as if the accursed gunshot, which even today resounds sinisterly within my mind whenever I rend the veils of my memory and relive the nefarious past as if it were the present, were scattering, one by one, the molecules that comprised my life. In this passage, Camilo refers to the manner he chose to kill himself, a bullet to the head, creating a series of effects that he describes below. Human language has not felt the need to invent words exact and clear enough to define the absolutely inconceivable impressions that start to contaminate the self of a suicide in the early hours following the tragedy. These impressions rise and increase, become intricate, take root and crystallize in a crescendo that creates a mental and vibrational state that humans cannot at all comprehend, because it is beyond their grasp as human beings, who by the mercy of God have been spared by such abnormality. To understand and properly measure the intensity, that dramatic shock, it would take another spirit whose faculties had been buried in the fires of the same suffering. From the confused darkness into my spirit, which plunged after the fall of my physical body, I gradually felt, coming back to life within me, the supreme attribute to the divine paternity has granted to those who over the course of the millennia are to reflect his image and likeness, conscience, memory, the divine gift of thought. I felt an iciness penetrating my whole being. I was shivering. The unpleasant feeling that garments of ice were clinging to my body provoked by indescribable bad feelings. Moreover, there was no air in my lungs, which led me to believe that I had wished to desert life. Death was indeed finally approaching, with its cortege of excruciating symptoms. Here Camillo is describing what we had just reviewed theoretically in the Spirit's book regarding the effects of this violent death in his perispirit. He deceptively believed that he had not yet died and that he was still under the agonies of death. He was unable to properly breathe and failed to perceive his body normally to the point of his mistakenly feeling cold. The narrative continues as follows. Putrid and nauseous odors, however, brutally offended my sense of smell. An acute, violent, maddening pain instantly came over my entire body, particularly in the area of my brain and auditory system. Overcome by indescribable convulsions of physical pain, I lifted my hand to my right ear. Blood was coming from the hole caused by the bullet I had used to commit suicide, staining my hands, clothes, and body. The description that Camillo makes is a recurring phenomenon with those who commit suicide. Like Camillo, the person feels as if she has shot herself in the ear and is covered in blood, a blood flow that never stops. In fact, these are the effects of physical death on the perispirit. Because the body continues to feel alive, it constantly feels bloody. A person who hangs herself, for example, constantly feels the anguish of suffocation. A person who jumps off a building feels as if falling uninterruptedly. She jumps, hits the ground, and then falls again, repeating the cycle. The person who throws herself in front of a train also goes through the process repeatedly. This is one of the greatest torments that a person who commits suicide can experience. I could not see a thing. However, one must recall that suicide was due to the fact that I was going blind, an atonement I considered to be above my strength, and an unjust punishment by nature against my eyes, which needed their sight so I could make an honest, worthy living. Thus, I found myself still blind, and to further add to my state of disorientation, I was wounded. Only wounded, not dead. Life continued in me just like before my suicide. In spite of myself, ideas started to gather in my mind. I saw my life in retrospect all the way back to infancy. Not even my final act was omitted. That added step for which I was completely responsible. Since I felt I was still alive, I consequently deduced that the wound I had tried to kill myself with had not done its job, and that this only added to the dreadful sufferings that had plagued my life for such a long time. I thought I must be lying in bed in a hospital, or one in my own house. In this passage, his state of confusion clearly shows he still believed to be living in his physical body. However, since it was impossible for me to recognize the place because I could not see, the ailments that afflicted me and the loneliness that surrounded me distressed me to no end. Meanwhile, sinister presentiments conveyed the feeling that an irreversible event had taken place. I cried out for my family members, for my friends that had been kind enough to accompany me at critical times. But the most unnerving silence was all I received in response. I angrily called for nurses, for doctors who could possibly take care of me in case I was actually in a hospital or not in my home. I called for servants, maids, whoever they might be, to open the windows of the room where I thought I had laid, so that streams of fresh air could bring comfort to my lungs. I needed them to bring me warm blankets and light the fireplace and to alleviate the chill that numbed my limbs, providing relief to the ruling pain that had invaded my whole body, and to bring me some food and water because I was starving and thirsty. Here Camillo even speaks about the psychological needs he was feeling. These are physical needs which the paraspirit feels because of the abrupt nature of death. To my astonishment, instead of the kind answers I so desperately longed for, what I heard, instead, after a few hours, was a deafening roar. Vague and far away at first, as if arising from a nightmare, it gradually became defined, clearly and conclusively audible. A sinister chorus of many voices mixed together in turmoil, disoriented, like a gathering of the deranged. In this passage, Camillo describes his companions of misfortune buried in the cemetery where his body rested. Those voices, however, were not talking to each other in conversation. They blasphemed, complained about multiple misfortunes, lamented, protested, howled, screamed furiously, moaned, agonized, and wept disconsolately, and weeping rendered heinous due to its particularly desperate and despondent tone. Filled with rage, they begged for help and compassion. From his description, we see the kind of spirits who were trapped in such suffering. They begged fervently for help and compassion and were desperate and tormented. Surprisingly, although their great suffering, they maintained an enormous sense of pride. I felt my way in the darkness as I tried to walk. However, it was as if strong roots held me to the same cold, humid place. I could not get away. Indeed, it felt like heavy chains had imprisoned me, shackling me to the eerie, unknown bed, making it impossible for me to leave. After all, how could I escape if I was wounded, weakened by a loss of blood, my clothes stained with it? Besides, I was blind, completely blind. How could I present myself to anyone in such a repugnant state? I made a desperate effort to get up, my body cold as ice, my muscles rigid from an overall numbness, made intent extremely difficult, but I was finally able to stand. Upon doing so, however, a penetrating odor of blood and putrid viscera spread around me, revolting and nauseating. It came from the very spot where I'd been laying. I could not understand how the bed I'd been lying in could have such a disagreeable smell. In my mind, it was the same bed I had slept in every night. But what a terrible stench! To explain this strange affliction, I attributed it to the wound I had inflicted on myself, to the blood that gushed out, staining my clothes. Indeed, I did find myself covered in a vicious matter, a revolting sludge that oozed from my own body, drenching my clothes, which I was astounded to find were quite formal in spite of me being constrained to a bed for the sick. But at the same time, I was offering myself these explanations. I was confounded by questions asking how it could be that way, how a simple wound, in spite of the blood it shed, could produce such foulness without my friends or the nurses cleaning it up. Camillo comments about the clothes he was wearing. Almost certainly he was wearing a cutaway frock coat of the kind that was common in that period and within which he was buried. Upset because everybody had abandoned me at such a critical time, I felt my way in the dark, intending to find the usual door to my room. At a certain point, I stumbled on a heap of debris and instinctively bent down to find out what it was. I was suddenly gripped by irredeemable madness, and I began screaming and howling like a deranged demon. responding in the same dramatic totality as the macabre symphony whose chorus of voices had not ceased to strike my ears in intermittent and distressing expectation. The heap of debris was nothing less than earth covering a recently dug grave. I did not know how, but despite my blindness, I could see the things that surrounded me in the darkness. It was a cemetery. The grave, with their sad crosses of white marble or dark wood flanked by pensive angels, were all lined up in the majestic immobility of the drama they were a part of. My confusion only increased. Why was I here? How did I get here, since I could not recall doing so? And what did I come here to do, all alone, wounded, hurting, and exhausted? I had attempted suicide, true, but a macabre whisper, like an unmovable suggestion from conscience explaining to my bewildered memory what it had just seen, reverberated thunderously in my alarmed inner being. You wanted to commit suicide, didn't you? Well, there you have it. Camilo is recounting all the drama he experienced. Through his narrative, we see the great difficulties he experienced immediately after understanding what he had done. He, who sought to liberate himself from physical blindness through death, blind as a spirit, only managed to intensely magnify his own suffering by going towards the third servant from the parable of the great banquet studied in the previous chapter. He refused the invitation of the second servant, the pain of atonement, symbolized by his blindness. The servant invited him to participate in the great banquet so that he could develop love, meekness, and humility, and all the other virtues deriving from those. Instead, he met the third servant, the terrible suffering he imposed on himself. Such suffering finally forced him to attend the great banquet, but only after many years had passed.